Thank you for coming out this afternoon. Now, obviously, the book takes up quite a lot of, quite a big chunk of history. It starts in the 7th century, meanders through Europe, and then comes to the United States up until the 21st century. There's no way I can do a talk to justify all of that. So today, instead, I'm going to focus on the question of women, and in particular, how women have been used, Muslim women or brown women, have been used to further an imperial agenda. So that's the focus of today's talk. Now, let's start with the present context before we go back to the 19th century. The dominant image of Muslim women today is that of the oppressed victim, a person who lacks political agency, a person who cannot stand up for herself, and therefore must be rescued by Western governments because she simply cannot act in meaningful ways upon the world. So this is the image that usually comes to mind: a scared, passive woman in a full burqa, waiting and not actually taking any action on the world. Here is another one. And these are images actually of Afghan women, which have been quite dominant in the mainstream media, particularly after the events of 9/11. In fact, it has become so predominant that we even have cartoons in the American context about this. Here is a woman longing to be free, apparently being used as an ottoman, as a footstool, right? Now, the question is, why did this particular image become dominant in the United States, in Canada, in Western Europe, and so forth? Well, what we call the dominant definers of news, these are political figures, and so forth, elite figures, actually started to talk about this issue to some extent in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. So here are some quotes that I have from various figures. This is Laura Bush saying, "Fighting brutality against women and children is not the expression of a specific culture. It is the acceptance of our common humanity, a commitment shared by people of goodwill on every continent. The fight against terrorism is also a fight for the rights and dignity of women." So what happens is that in the lead up to the US invasion of Afghanistan, one of the justifications that gets given is that we have to go and rescue Afghan women from the suffering that they're facing at the hands of the Taliban. Now, it is true that the Taliban did treat women poorly, but what's interesting is that prior to September 2001, it really didn't matter. There's very little attention to this question, even though feminist organizations had been trying to draw attention to it. But of course, back in the 1990s, the United States was more than happy to work with the Taliban because they were trying to build a pipeline. UNOCAL was trying to build a pipeline through Afghanistan in order to access Caspian Sea natural gas and oil reserves. I did a study of media attention to Afghan women and their suffering and found that, let's see, what did I find? In 1999, there were 37 broadcast reports, that includes radio and television, on the plight of Afghan women. In the period between January 1st, 2000, and September 11th, 2001, there were a grand total of 33 broadcast media reports. And then, in just a 4-month period, right, after these prominent definers of news have told us that the US is going to go in and rescue Afghan women, we see between September 1 and January 1, 628 news media reports. It's not as if suddenly, in this period, Afghan women were suffering even more than they were in the 4 months before that, but they become politically useful to sustain a larger imperialist agenda. So I start off with this because I think what gets hidden from this narrative, and I'm going to show you one more cartoon in terms of what the US's agenda was. You see that, right? You see how the US is going there to liberate women, to educate them, to set up schools and colleges and so forth. What gets left out of this picture, which has now become common sense, is the idea, our hidden facts, is the idea that since the 1950s, girls in Kabul and other major cities in Afghanistan have in fact attended schools. Half of university students used to be women. Women made up 40% of Afghanistan's doctors, 70% of its teachers, and 30% of its civil servants. But the attack on women's rights were real. It did happen. And it was begun actually back in the late 1980s and early 90s at the behest of the Mujahideen. These are the holy warriors that the US would train and fund to the tune of billions, not million, billions of dollars. They would fight the proxy war against the Soviet Union in the 1980s, and then once they trounced the Soviet Union, they get on with the business of attacking civil society right inside Afghanistan. In fact, some of the figures that were recruited by the CIA to fight in this holy war were people like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. I don't know if you've heard of this unsavory character. He comes to light in Pakistan because he used to throw acid on the faces of women who were unveiled. But he was one of the key assets of the CIA, one of the key recruits, as was Osama bin Laden. This is now public knowledge, isn't it, that Osama bin Laden was a key CIA asset. He was toured through the Middle East and beyond in order to recruit for this Afghan war. So needless to say, once these figures have actually won the war with the Soviet Union, when they come to power, they systematically begin the attack on women's rights. Now, a couple more things about women's rights. Afghanistan's constitution was written in 1964. It ensured basic rights for women, such as universal coverage and equal pay. And a small number of women even held important political posts as members of parliament and as judges. And the fact of the matter is that the images that I showed you at the beginning of this slide presentation are contemporary images. They do not go back historically. Most women in Afghanistan did not wear the burqa. Even devout Muslim women actually only wore headscarves and long dresses, but not the burqa. Now, there are plenty of women, Afghan and their supporters, who have written about this issue. And one of the key voices who has been speaking out, not just against the Taliban and against the Northern Alliance and against US intervention, is a woman by the name of Malalai Joya. I'm going to show you an image of her book. And she has written very beautifully about how, in fact, women have not been liberated since the US NATO intervention. She cites a number of human rights groups and their reports and so forth. And she actually comes out of a long tradition of women as well as men fighting for greater rights within Afghan society. So one such group, Malalai Joya is not part of RAWA, but one such group that you may have heard of is known as the Revolutionary Association of Women of Afghanistan. Was founded in 1977 and has been active in fighting for women's rights in that country. But these sorts of stories don't get told, because if we show that Muslim women have the ability to fight for their own rights and actually win it, then you don't need bombs, you don't need machine guns, you don't need planes going in from the West to supposedly rescue them. Now, I had the pleasure when Joya came to do her US book tour of actually hosting her at Columbia University, and I got to interview her for an article, and this is what she said about Afghan women. I'll let you read it. And so there you have it, a woman member of parliament who comes out of a tradition of active women fighting for rights, political rights for men and women and so on, saying in very clear, plain terms that the situation for the vast majority of women has deteriorated since the US intervention. My interview with her was about 4 years ago, so I pulled up some more recent statistics for you. There was a study published by the University of Notre Dame. It's by Cartwright and Wall. And what they say is that sexual violence in particular against women has gotten much worse since the US invasion over a decade ago. In fact, they say that 87.2% of women have been subject to violence, quote, including forced marriage, honor crimes, rape, and sexual and physical abuse. It is estimated that 81% of all women in Afghanistan will experience domestic violence at some point in their lives, 81% of Afghan women. And this shouldn't come as a surprise to us because, as she points out, the people who replaced the Taliban were, as she puts it, the misogynistic warlords of the Northern Alliance. And these are the people who populate the US-allied Karzai government. So it's not surprising that they recently passed a law making it legal for marital rape. That is, if you are raped within a marriage, you can't go and seek any justice for it. Now, the occupation forces have actually made the situation a lot worse as well. Cartwright and Wall say that they have produced, quote, new forms of powerlessness for many Afghan women and girls who have been widowed, displaced, and trafficked and forced into marriage as a direct or indirect result of the conflict between the occupiers and the Taliban insurgency. In fact, here is how a group of women in Kandahar summed it up when some British researchers were there trying to assess the situation for women. Here's how they put it. They said, quote, "It is like the Taliban times for women now. We are in the same situation as then. We cannot come out of the house to earn extra money or get an education. The only difference is that our honor was safe then, but it is not now." Because as horrific as the Taliban were and as awful as their punishments were for women, at the very least, if a woman went to a Taliban court and said, "I was raped by someone other than my husband," they could get some justice. Now, even that is no longer possible because the warlords, are the people doing the raping and the molestation. But during the day, they don the judges' outfits, and so there is no justice for women anymore on that front. They do point out, however, that some gains have been made around education and healthcare, but overall the situation for women is quite dire. Now, this is not common sense. For the most part, this is not what we read about either in the United States or in Canada in relation to the plight of Afghan women. Instead, this is what we see. This is Time magazine from 2010. It has the picture of Bibi Aisha, whose nose was cut off, and there's some controversy as to whether the Taliban did it or somebody else did it. But it's emblematic of this argument that if the United States leaves Afghanistan, this is what's going to happen to women. So she is brought to the United States. Her injuries were healed. But as we can see quite clearly, all this is an imperial facelift, right? It makes them look good to actually do these sorts of things, when in reality, the conditions that caused this for somebody like Bibi Aisha haven't been changed. And so, there's been at least a decade of such arguments being put forward, and yet Amnesty USA in 2012 ran a bunch of ads which featured images of Afghan women in burqas with the caption, "Human rights for women in Afghanistan, NATO, keep the progress going." In other words, don't come back. And this is Amnesty International. This is not some sort of co-opted organization. So it's unfortunate that it's become this prevalent even among human rights groups. And what explains the continuity of this argument from 2001 all the way up to the present, despite evidence to the contrary, has been explored in an excellent piece by Saadia Tour called Imperialist Feminism Redux, right? Because what we see at work here is the appropriation of feminism in order to serve imperial aims. And every year it appears that this argument gets more and more sophisticated, and Tour actually looks at why it is that this argument is now resonating despite evidence to the contrary. And what she finds really is that the reason why it has more resonance today is because, unlike at earlier points in the 2000s and 2001, 2002, and 2003, you had a branch of the US foreign policy establishment known as the neoconservatives. You may have heard of them. They were the people who were behind the Bush administration, and they were the ones who first used this argument. They don't have that much credibility. And the brown women that they brought forward to make these arguments, there were people like Ayan Hirsi Ali, who is a woman who is associated with the neocons, clearly benefits financially and so on from making this argument. Those people and their credibility started to be questioned once the Bush ideology started to crack, right? In 2008, we had an election in the United States, and the entire Bush agenda was rejected. How does this argument then survive into the Obama age? And what Saadia Tor argues, is that now what you have are genuine feminists, women from South Asia, women from North Africa, in alliance with genuine feminists in the United States who have come together in an organization known as the Center for Secular Space in order to make this argument. And they rely on their anti-imperialist and feminist credentials to put this argument forward. And the thrust, if you go to their website, the thrust of their argument is that Western liberals, they say, and they have attacked Amnesty International, they've attacked the Center for Constitutional Rights and so on, and what they say is that multiculturalism, in the name of multiculturalism, human rights advocates have betrayed women in this part of the world, which is of course not true, but it is a much more sophisticated variation on what used to be a neoconservative argument. The thing is, that's one part of the argument, that the debate and the imperialist feminism has become much more liberal, it has become much more complex and so forth. But more and more, the two sides, the conservative version of this argument and the liberal versions of this argument, are beginning to look indistinguishable. And so I'm going to show you a video that comes from the conservative wing and explain why the arguments that are made here are problematic. This is a clip from a video called The Third Jihad. It was shown continuously on a loop to New York Police Department officers as a way to introduce them to Islam and what that means to the people who practice Islam.
Isn't it time for the unbelievers to discard these incoherent, illogical beliefs, theories, and conjecture? Isn't it time for every Christian, Jew, pagan, and atheist to cast off the cloak of spiritual darkness which enshrouds them and emerge into the light of Islam?
Have you ever stopped to think about what would happen if the Islamists won and their version of Sharia law was put into place? All you need to do is look at countries like Saudi Arabia, Iran, Sudan, and Somalia.
The Islamo-fascists who are attacking the world want to impose their beliefs on the world.
Not many people are aware of the fact that in Iran you'll find the so-called modesty police patrolling the streets.
گلمون وانتود هم تنگه هم خیلی چکش بازه. بله دیگه فقط موهاتون الان بیرون نشارتون رو زحمت بکشین درست کنین. توی کشور اسلامی زندگی میکنین درسته. موهاتون هم الان کاملا پیداست. آرایشتون هم تنده. شلوارتون هم که کوتاهه. شما با ما تشریف میارید داخل اتوبوس.
If women are caught wearing the wrong clothing, they could be fined or even arrested.
To women entering this shop in Tehran, a message saying all clothes sold here have been approved by the police. The length and size of coats, nothing too short, nothing too tight, and mostly in black. Women who shop here know there's no risk of getting a warning or being arrested for indecency.
من هؤلاء الذين يقررون لي ماذا يجب أن أكون عليه؟ لماذا تعاملوني كسيدة كأنني ناقصة الأهلية وهنالك دائما صوت ذكوريا يقرر لي ما يجب أن أكون عليه؟
As a woman, if you, and all individuals are different, but if you are an individual woman with a strong character and you rebel against this kind of life, you run more than anyone else the risk of being beaten. Abused, your spirit being killed by your own family, by your own loved ones.
ولا بد أن نعلم أن الضرب عقوبة شرعية لا يملك إنسان أن ينكره لأن الذي شرعها هو الذي خلق هذا الإنسان.
هو لا شك أن الضرب هو يعتبر وسيلة من وسائل الإصلاح.
قال لي أنا ماني جاي أضربك، أنا جاي أقتلك. ومسك في رقبتي وسدحني على الأرض وبدأ يخنق فيها بنظرات يعني.
But the issue of men controlling women's lives goes much deeper. It can even result in murder.
Just another teenager with everything to live for, except that Heshu Yonez was trapped between two cultures. When she began a relationship with a Christian Lebanese boy, her strict Kurdish Muslim father slit her throat.
Chowdhury Rashid is charged with first-degree murder in the death over the weekend of his 25-year-old daughter, Sandila Kanwal. Based on what police say, this could be what's known as an honor killing, the murder of a woman, often by a family member, to punish her for shaming the family.
According to the United Nations, some 5,000 women and girls are victims of so-called honor killings every year. Whether it's because they've been seen talking to a man, refusing an arranged marriage, or even suffering rape, they're murdered for one reason only. They're perceived to have brought shame on their family. And it's often the family that carries out the sentence.
This is Aksa Parvez. Her father told authorities that he strangled her, allegedly, because she wouldn't wear a headscarf.
We are bound by the rules. If a woman runs away, she must be killed.
Good name is more important than the penalty. We don't care about the penalty. A good name is the most important thing in our world.
Islam does not countenance honor killing, but has nevertheless become part of Islam as practiced in much of the Islamic world.
Now, I don't mean to say that women in Iran, Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, or Iraq don't suffer from sexual violence, that they aren't victims of honor killings, and so on. Of course, that happens. But the mechanism at work in this particular video is one of othering. We view these women not with a sense of sympathy, not with a sense of pity, but with a sense in which we are superior. We don't do this in our societies. It's those barbarians that do this out there. Imagine for a second if we had to make a similar video of the United States, which is where I live. I know the statistics from that country. Latest reports show that every 6.2 minutes, a rape is reported in the United States. 1 in 5 women will be raped in their lifetime in that country. Most recently in January, there was much media attention to the brutal rape of this young Indian woman who then died. And that was just awful. It did happen. But what got papered over is a gang rape at a school, a Steubenville High School, where the football team repeatedly gang raped this comatose teenage young girl, right? And that gets passed over because our rape is very different from their rape, right? Or I'll just give you a few more examples of what a film of this nature about the United States might look like. Let's rewind to November of 2012. A 16-year-old was gang raped in Richmond, California. The month before that, a 15-year-old in New Orleans. On April of last year, 6 men gang raped a 14-year-old in Chicago. Those are just some gang rape statistics. Last September in New York City, in Central Park, a beautiful place, by the way, that I would encourage you, if you visit New York City, to go and to visit. A 73-year-old woman was raped last September. One more statistic. A New York City policeman was arrested last October because he had laid out a very serious plan to kidnap, rape, cook, and eat a woman. Any woman, wasn't any particular woman, any woman, it wasn't personal. So if I had to put together a video with those stories, how do you think the United States would look? It would look pretty misogynistic. In fact, it would look quite crazy. So in other words, the point here is not to say that women do not face oppression, that women do not face sexual violence, women are not murdered. They are everywhere. But when we present this sort of flat orientalist view of other parts of the world, it doesn't promote solidarity. Instead, it promotes imperialist feminism. And what we never see are women acting as agents on behalf of their own rights. This is a photograph from Pakistan where women are fighting against rape laws that are sexist. This is Asma Jahangir, a very prominent human rights and women's rights lawyer from Pakistan. This is Shirin Ebadi. She got the Nobel Peace Prize, Iranian woman, strong activist for women's rights, for human rights, and so on. And so, of course, this process of othering is all about victimhood minus agency, minus political agency. So I start with this contemporary moment, but the point that I want to make is that this idea of Muslim women, as Gayatri Spivak put it long ago, of brown women in need of rescue by white men from brown men, is one that actually goes back to the colonial period. It goes back in particular to the high point of colonialism in the 19th century, when, as one scholar put it, there was an obsession actually with rescuing Muslim women. And here is how he put it. Where does he say? He says, there is no subject connected with Islam which Europeans have thought more important than the condition of Muslim women. And so the dominant narrative that we take for granted today, and that is the bedrock of much of these arguments and this imagery, really comes from the 19th century. And at that time, the way that Muslim women were thought of, primarily by men, primarily by powerful white men, were as severely subjugated, oppressed, and actually little more than slaves. The word slave was used quite often. And the argument went is as Muslim despots tyrannized their subjects in general, they also tyrannized their wives and daughters. Of course, the reality was much more complex than that. As various scholars have shown, European women actually didn't have access to women in the Middle East and North Africa and the regions that they were colonizing, right? They couldn't actually go and interview Muslim women to find out what their lives were like. So what this was is an elaborate construction for what they thought the situation for Muslim women actually was. And when one expert says it, then you can just cite that person, and hence the story goes. Feminist scholars have actually looked at travel writing by the wives of colonial administrators who moved to these various countries, and they did have access to Muslim women, right? Arab women, to Persian women, and so on. And they tell a much more complex and sophisticated story, on the one hand of oppression, but on the other hand of agency as well. But that's not the story, of course, that existed in the mainstream. And so, needless to say, didn't make it into the imperialist feminist rhetoric of yesteryear. Now, I thought instead of laying out or giving you a bunch of quotes from colonial administrators, and I will, I would do this through the medium of painting, of oil paintings from the 19th century, to show you how this imagery, this rescue narrative of Muslim women comes into being. And the starting point of the story really is 1798, when Napoleon invades Egypt. He invades Egypt in 1798. And in the book, I actually talk about how this is a very important moment in modern colonialism, because I call it enlightened colonialism, because for the first time, you actually see the use of systematic propaganda in a way you hadn't before. You know, Napoleon was an avid reader of Egyptian history and politics and so on. He'd been preparing for decades to go off and be this rescuer of the Egyptian people. He prints these pamphlets and so on. I don't have time to go into all of the details, but suffice it to say that ideology and propaganda are very important in this process. Now, one example that we see in oil paintings is actually what happens during his campaign is that Napoleon orders the poisoning of 50 plague-infested people in Jaffa, or Jaffa, however you want to pronounce it. And this was not a good thing. It's not a way to sell yourself if you're going around killing people, right? So he quickly commissions a painting. Those days, they didn't have videos. Today, the PR industry calls it damage control. They quickly produce a video news release as a way to, clear the air and so on. So he commissioned a painting, and this was the painting. Napoleon at a plague house in Jaffa. Can you see it? Okay. This is Napoleon in the center. And if you can see what he's doing, he's actually touching a plague victim, right? So not only did he not poison them, he even went and touched the untouchables thereby standing in the long line of God, of course, who has the healing touch, but kings as well, who have the healing touch. So this was, one of the first instances of this kind of propaganda that Napoleon and others put out, which is that Napoleon and the French are there to heal and to rescue the colonized from themselves and from the local enemies that they may have. Now, at around the same time, Napoleon's sister actually commissioned another painting. It was called La Grande Odalisque. A lot can be said about this, including the kind of anatomically problematic proportions here. She'd probably have to have a zillion ribs to be that long, but we won't talk about that. The backbone would have to be gigantically long to actually conform to that, but that's not the point I wish to make. Instead, what you see here is one of the first few paintings of the harem in this period, and it's really a sense in which, Muslim women would come to be seen. And if you look at her, she's a very passive person. She's just lying down without any clothes. We know that she's not a European woman because of the scenery, rich tapestry made of silk. She is carrying a fan which has peacocks. So all of these are sort of oriental exoticizing elements. And here is this supine, coy woman who is looking back at the person observing the painting, inviting that person to possess them, right? And in fact, this image of women is not that different from the image of Western women in oil painting. John Berger has a book called Ways of Seeing, in which he talks about how rich men who could commission paintings did so of their possessions, of their houses, of their horses, and of their women. And this pose of gazing back, of being in a state of undress, was how Western European women were painted as well. But this, of course, is orientalized. And in addition to that, there's another layer we can draw from this, and that is that she is somebody we can possess, and she's inviting the possession. But here, it's not just a European woman in being presented here. Because she's, an Oriental woman, we can see the possession of the body as signaling the way towards the possession of the nation, right? So a woman's body comes to stand in for the nation itself. And that's not my own clever little reading. I'm not an expert on Oriental painting. This argument has been made by many scholars, including Malek Alullah. If you have had a chance to look at his book, it's called The Colonial Harem, and he looks at how postcards of semi-naked Algerian women become a way in which possessing a woman's body becomes a symbol for possessing the land. Now let me show you one more. Actually, several more. What can we say about this? Well, again, they are languid, they're sitting, they're passive. And in fact, historians who've looked at this painting say that, first of all, this is unrealistic because they usually would be children in the harem. You wouldn't have these languid women sitting around sort of waiting for their men to come back home. But even beyond that, this has been compared more to a bordello, a French bordello, than what a harem would look like. So here you see the imaginary work going on. It's the projection of very great painters, by the way. Delacroix is an amazing painter. This is not to critique his art. It is to critique the ideology behind it, right? And here you have an imaginary geography, as Edward Said would put it. It is his sexual fantasies that are being projected onto this oil painting. You might note that the only person with some agency, that is someone who's sitting, who can move, is the black slave. Through much of the other paintings that I'm going to show you, women are just sitting there as objects, waiting for men to use them or to possess them, and so forth. Here is Jerome, another amazing painter, and this is his pool in a harem. Again, you have the black woman as the slave. And interestingly, some of these women actually start to look a bit European, right? The one with the red hair. It's not to say that Turkish and Algerian women don't have blonde and red hair and so on, but scholars have observed how this is so much a projection of their fantasies, European men's fantasies, onto spaces where these sorts of things seem permissible and seem possible. Okay, one more. No, actually it goes the other way around. Okay, when men actually enter the picture with Muslim women, with Arab women, typically they're barbaric. As you see in the case of this painting, it's called Death of Sardanapalus. And immediately in the foreground, you see an Arab man, because you recognize him as such because of his headgear. And you know immediately from the surroundings, the orientalized surroundings, that this is set somewhere in the Middle East. And in fact, it is based on a play by Lord Byron, and it's about the death of an Assyrian king, Sardanapalus. Now, the first thing we can notice here is that there is an orgiastic scene that's going on, and part of what's being conveyed here is the sort of sexual excesses of these people that we cannot identify with. And part of what characterizes these excesses is their brutality, right? If you can see the impression on the emperor's face, he's looking pretty calm, even though there's a dead woman on his mattress. Others are in various states of suffering and violence and so on. He's just sitting there. And part of what a European at that time would have viewed this and gathered, other than, taking visual pleasure from the naked women, from the nudes, actually, there's a difference between naked and nude. Between the nudes here and what's going on is this would never happen in my society. We would never treat women this way, and certainly we cannot identify with the ruler in this particular scene. Now, this idea of a deviant sexuality you see played out even in other paintings. This is hints of pedophilia, yeah? Young boys out there for the pleasure of older men, clearly in a power dynamic where consent has not been obtained. And here's another one. And the way I read this is that this woman in the foreground, blonde hair, very white, it's probably a warning to white women. If you don't control yourself, if you are not willing to be policed by your men, this is a fate that affects you, that will await you, and hints at necrophilia, right? And the brown man in the background who is obviously orchestrating all of this that's taking place. Okay. Now the question is why? Why are Muslims so deviant, and why are Muslim men so horrible? Well, Delacroix has an answer. This painting is really called Fanatics of Tangier. And as you can see in the middle, the green flag of Islam is more or less the entire story. So if men treat women these ways, then of course it's because Islam makes them behave in these fashions. I said earlier that the idea of women, Muslim women as slaves is part of the literature. I'm going to show you the image of that. This is Jerome's The Slave Market. And you can see the woman in the middle, completely naked, being sold into slavery. Needless to say, we don't do that in the West, and therefore white men on their stallions need to gallop off and rescue these women from this horrific fate. Now, that is a sort of brief overview of the 19th century portrayal of Muslim women and the rescue narrative. But you actually see that this continues even in the 20th century. So you see these examples not just in painting, but also in novels. You see them in films in the early 20th century. So I want to show you an example from Hollywood. And this is a film known as The Sheikh, which was produced in 1921. imperialist feminism. Okay, so there are a couple of things that we can say about this video. First of all, in the United States, there is a long tradition of seeing men of color as wanting to rape and vanquish white women, and therefore white women need to be saved. This goes back to the Native Americans. The work of Richard Slotkin, for instance, shows that this argument was used to then justify genocide. And you're seeing that played out now in relation to brown men. But the most awful version of this, of course, is in relation to black men, right? Black men as these lusty, horrible creatures from whom white women need to be protected. And the best example, when I teach my classes, I usually show this clip in conjunction with a film called Birth of a Nation. You may know of it. It was, the protagonist of this film is the Ku Klux Klan. And it was the highest grossing film at that point. And there is a similar rape scene where the woman jumps off a high cliff and kills herself and so on. But what's different we can notice between these two scenes is that whereas in the earlier scene she kills herself and is waiting for the Ku Klux Klan to come and save her, and they don't, in this case she actually stands up for herself. Right? She says, I'm not used to being ordered. And so here you see that when these same women around the same time are transported to the Middle Eastern context, suddenly they become feminists. Because it's not just about the United States, it is now about projecting a particular version of the West as being superior and of our women as being superior in this context. I had a couple more examples of this, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to skip ahead. There's a show called Homeland where the Jerome image actually is almost literally reproduced. Homeland, the show, was produced over the last few years, but I don't have time to do that. So I'm going to start to come to the last part of my presentation and bring it to a close. And that is, on the one hand, I have argued that the images that get produced of Middle Eastern women typically are invested in power relations and imperial relations. And what we almost never get to see is the role that women have played in their own societies in fighting for their liberation as well as those of men. So just a few of those images: women from 2011 in Egypt, full burqa, and yet she's a political agent carrying a sign which says, "Down with Mubarak," being harassed by the police alongside a man. Women who don't wear head covering, equal opportunity brutality by the Mubarak thugs. Both women and men throwing stones at the security apparatus. Here is one with the women right in the middle there, facing the wrath of the state. Here's another. Even Saudi Arabia, Tunisia. I'm not going to go into this, but suffice it to say that women have fought back. But I don't want to give the impression somehow that the image of victim is completely wrong, as I said earlier. Instead, we have to look at the issue of women's liberation and women's status in various countries around the Middle East with nuance, right? And when we do that, we find that the question of how women were going to be in the public sphere is not something that came up just recently in the context of what's called the Arab Spring and the Arab uprisings in Tunisia, Egypt, and elsewhere. This question became front and center in the context of decolonizing struggles, right? Large part of this part of the world was colonized either by France or by Britain. And in the context of fighting back, men and women who are involved in the national liberation struggle start to talk about what should be the role of women in society. In fact, they even talk about things like clothing, right? And they start to agitate around this question. And so when we talk about what is the status of women in the Muslim world, we're raising an extremely problematic question because there is no one status. The status varies depending on city, country, region, class, ethnicity. It depends on the history of decolonization and the extent to which Islam was or was not used in the national liberation struggle. It depends on the role that particular women have played at particular times and their male allies, and how far or how short these goals have gone. It depends on the extent of colonization. Did the colonizer actually have a physical presence there, or was it more indirect, and so on? So these are very complex questions for us to look at, but at the same time, we have to underscore and recognize the moments when women have been active. I'll just give a few examples of this. In Egypt, women who were involved in the national liberation struggle actually were at the forefront of this process. Leila Abu Lughod writes about this, and she talks about how they were far more strident and principled than their male comrades in fighting British colonialism. And they met with their European feminist counterparts. They talked about conditions, and they brought back ideas that made sense for them. And sometimes these women are dismissed as just being stooges of the West and so on, but in fact they were not. They were people who thought for themselves. They were critical of colonization, but they were also critical of Zionism. They had their own mindset, their own mentality, and so forth. So if you want to read more about this, I would recommend a book by Leila Abu Lughod called Remaking Women, which actually looks at the struggle for women's rights beginning at the turn not of the 21st century, but of the 20th century, and was contradictory. On the one hand, there were arguments for women's participation in the public sphere, greater emphasis on education, on taking political office. On the other hand, there was an emphasis on scientific management of the home. Okay, there was a way in which a modern nation needed women who could scientifically manage the home and produce the next generation, and so forth. So I think to come to a close with this lecture, and then I'd like to open it up for your comments and questions, I think the key for us, if we consider ourselves to be progressives, if we think at all of the situation that women are experiencing anywhere in the world and feel empathy towards it, we have to first and foremost reject the logic of imperialist feminism, because never has an empire ever liberated women anywhere in the world. There are no examples of this, right? And so if we do that, and if we reject intervention by the US government, by European governments, by NATO, and so on, what should we put in its place? Fact of the matter is that women have all over the world been fighting back. Most recently, this was a letter that a group of Indian feminists sent to their brothers and sisters at Harvard University. Harvard is setting up a policy task force called Beyond Gender Equality to advise the Indian government around the recent rape that took place. And they wrote back and they said, "Thank you very much." And I'm not going to read the whole letter. "Not since the days of Catherine Mayo have American women and American feminists felt such a concern for their less privileged third world sisters. Mayo's concern at that time was to ensure that the Indian state, then the colonial state, did not leave Indian women in the lurch at the mercy of their men, and that it retained power and the rule of the colonizer." And it goes on to say how in India, a group of lawyers and feminists have got together and they have put forward a set of recommendations on how to go forward on this question. It says, "This is clearly something that we Indian feminists and activists who have been involved in the women's movement here for several decades apparently are incapable of doing. And it was with a sense of overwhelming relief that we read your intention to step up into the breach." So it's a very polite but very sarcastic letter, which eventually leads to this. It says, this may be useful in your efforts to advise our government." That is all the research that they've done. They sent to Harvard and they said, "This may be useful in your efforts to advise our government. One of the greatest things about sisterhood is that it is so global. Feminism builds such strong international connections, such that whenever our first world sisters see that we are incapable of dealing with problems in our own countries, they immediately step in to help us out and provide us with much needed guidance and support. We are truly grateful for this. Perhaps you should allow us to repay the favor. The next time President Obama wants to put in place legislation to do with abortion or with equal rights amendment, we can step in and help. And from our small bit of experience in these fields, recommend what the United States can do." And so I think they've put quite well why we have to reject this white woman's burden argument and instead approach this from a question of solidarity. Approach it from an understanding that, in fact, the slut walk movement, which was birthed in Canada, in Toronto, when a Toronto policeman referred to a woman and said, if you didn't dress like a slut, then you wouldn't be raped, and so on. That movement spread all over the world because there was a universal recognition that women's oppression and the violence that women face look different in different parts of the world, but the key is to have solidarity between one another and stand together as sisters with our male allies to forge forward. And so that's the message that I want to end with. Thank you.